For those of us who've joined today, I'm Frank Sysyn from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. This conference is being organized by the Holodomor Research and Educational Consortium, which is a project of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and financed by the Temerte Foundation, and we're very grateful for that finance. It is co-sponsored by the Department of History and Classics of the University of Alberta. The Institute is a research and publishing division of the university, and teaching goes on through departments, and many are cross-appointed in the two, and so we are pleased that the History and Classics Department joins us in sponsoring this conference. Today is a little more mixed day for our speakers and participants in that it'll be a conference day in which we talk of the Holodomor, but it'll also be a trip over to our Holodomor monument next to City Hall. Now, I warn you, you must think of this as Phoenix North. So Edmonton, in many ways, is like the cities of the American Southwest. That is a city that was built after the car and after the mall came, and is really very large in size and stretched out. And in that sense, it does remind me when I go into Phoenix or Las Vegas of having very many similar characteristics. It has one characteristic that they do not have, and that is it has a wonderful river valley. That is, it has one of the largest parks of any North American city, and you will, although the time of year is late and for foliage, but you will be able to see that on your way over. Our subway, which does exist, is not working today for crossing the river, so you'll be going by taxi. I'm afraid it also has another characteristic that Phoenix does not have, and that is it's a wee bit colder. And someone told me that as of today, there are little bits of ice appearing in some places, and if there are, walk carefully and put something on your head when you come, to those of us who are going to take our little excursion to downtown Edmonton. Our panel today is on Émigré Ukrainian community archives and collections. We have 4 speakers for our presentation this morning. The first of these will be Serge Cipko, here of the University of Alberta, and he will be speaking on the Holodomor and Canada's response archival findings. Please, yes.
Thank you, Frank. And I'm going to be talking about Émigré archives, but I will also be talking about public archives as well, especially the Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa. In July 1934, the Winnipeg Free Press published an editorial about the visit to Canada of Ewald Amende. Amende was the honorary secretary of the Vienna-based Interconfessional and International Relief Committee for the Starving Districts of the Soviet Union. And the stated purpose of his visit to North America was to bring groups together for joint action in the event of a reoccurrence of famine. Among other things, the Winnipeg Free Press editorial cautioned that the story of, quote, millions of human beings dying of starvation, quote, was one that could not, quote, lightly be put aside, unquote. And in Western Canada, it stressed, quote, we must be doubly aware of it, not only because of the thousands of our fellow citizens to whom these provinces are not places on a map, but connected by ties of association and of blood, unquote. There indeed were a good many people in Canada who had such ties of association and of blood, as the Winnipeg Free Press put it. Amende himself made this observation in his book, Human Life in Russia, when he referred to the many Ukrainians, Russians, Germans, and Jews in Winnipeg alone who had ancestral connections with Soviet territories. Official statistics confirm such observations. The 1931 Canadian census counted 225,113 Ukrainians, and as Frank pointed out yesterday, many of them had roots in Western Ukraine rather than Eastern Ukraine, and 88,148 Russians in Canada as a whole. There were also 473,544 Germans, including Mennonites, and 156,726 Jews in Canada, and some among these two groups had origins in Soviet territories, as we learned from Colin Neufeld's presentation yesterday. The population of Canada at that time was 10,376,379. Considering this significant population factor, one might expect to find famine-related materials in archives across Canada. In this paper, I will comment on the sort of materials I was able to find, to discover in various archives when carrying out the research for my book, Starving Ukraine, the Holodomor and Canada's Response. Perhaps one of the first places that one would expect an historian to turn to during a study of Canada and the Holodomor would be Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa. Indeed, this is where I found a good portion of the archival material that was applied to the book. A key collection that I perused there was the R.B. Bennett papers. Richard Bedford Bennett was the Prime Minister of Canada between 1930 and 1950. During those years, relations between the Soviet Union and Canada were strained. In 1931, the Bennett-led Conservative government imposed a partial embargo on trade with the Soviet Union. In response, the Soviet Union imposed a complete embargo on imports from Canada. Two particularly interesting items in the vast collection are a letter that Catherine Marjorie Stewart Murray, the Duchess of Atholl, wrote to the Canadian Prime Minister in 1934, and his reply to her. The Duchess of Atholl was a British Member of Parliament for the constituency of Kinross and West Perthshire in Scotland. Her letter to Prime Minister Bennett concerned the matter of the admission of the Soviet Union to the League of Nations, which was to be debated in Geneva on the 17th of September 1934. She expressed the opinion that it would be an act of hypocrisy if the League allowed the USSR to enter it without anything said about the conditions there. In his reply, Bennett intimated that he was aware of the famine from first-hand information received in Western Canada. As it turned out, even though Canada voted in favor of admitting the Soviet Union to the League of Nations, Bennett instructed Oscar Skelton, the Undersecretary of State for External Affairs, to bring up the famine during the debate in Geneva, which Skelton did. The Oscar Douglas Skelton Funds was another collection in Library and Archives Canada that was mined for the book. It is important to note that the Duchess of Atholl had earlier raised the matter of the famine in the British House of Commons on the 5th of July, 1933, citing the reports of British journalists Gareth Jones and Malcolm Muggeridge. It is also noteworthy, though, that the Canadian Prime Minister learned about the famine from local sources before Gareth Jones' story broke on the 29th of March, 1933. Nearly 2 weeks earlier, on the 16th of March, 1933, the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan adjourned its regular affairs to discuss the issue of the famine. The Mennonite Board in Rushthorne, Saskatchewan, was said to be receiving, on average, 700 to 800 letters a week from the Soviet Union. The discussion in Regina about the famine was extensively covered in the Canadian mainstream press. It prompted a letter to the editor by Volodymyr S. Plavyuk, which was published in the Edmonton Journal on the 20th of March, 1933. Plavyuk drew attention to the many letters he said had been received from Ukraine by local Ukrainian community members asking for grain and flour. Now, whenever one hears of this number of letters, a question that comes to the fore is whether any of these letters have been kept anywhere. I have been asked whether I have seen any of them in the archives. As an answer to that question, I should say that I have not looked in the Mennonite archives, which Colin Newfield referred to yesterday, but I did make copies of some of the letters that were published in the Mennonite newspaper Der Bote, which again Colin had mentioned yesterday. In several instances, Canadian mainstream newspapers publish excerpts of letters translated into English that were said to have come from the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian language press in Canada also published some letters. In terms of original letters, I make a reference in the book to German language letters that have been preserved in the provincial archives of Alberta, and one that has been kept in St. Vladimir's Ukrainian Orthodox Congregation Library and Archives in Calgary. A related question that has been asked is why were so many letters allowed to come to Canada? And we had this discussion a little bit yesterday. Considering the practice of strict censorship in the Soviet Union, I found the answer to that question not in the archives, but in a perceptive article in the Calgary Herald. The article, published in April 1933, pointed out that not all news from the Soviet Union came by cable. It then shared a letter received by, quote, a Calgary Russian from relatives in the Soviet Republic, unquote. The letter writer spoke of a, quote, syndicate in the city where there are all kinds of merchandise and food to be bought cheap, but only for dollars. You send the money to the syndicate, and they will send us as much goods as they feel like, unquote. The Calgary Herald commented that when one understood where the dollars would go, and, quote, guessed how little the syndicate will give for them to the sufferers, unquote, then it was not so difficult to comprehend why such letters were permitted to pass the censors. Volodymyr Plavyuk's letter to the editor in the Edmonton Journal also mentioned an offer of collective aid that was made by the Ukrainian Canadian farmers to famine sufferers in Ukraine, but was rejected by the Alliance of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies of the Soviet Union in September or October 1932. That refusal was highlighted in several of the anti-famine protest meetings that took place across Canada in 1933 and 1934. In total, there were around 80 such protest actions, organized mainly, but not exclusively, by Ukrainian groups. Typically, resolutions would be passed at such meetings and forwarded to provincial governments and to Ottawa, London, Great Britain, Washington, D.C., and Geneva. Copies of some of these resolutions can be found in Library and Archives Canada, but I did not see any when I visited the provincial archives of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. In terms of community archives, there are draft copies of resolutions by the Ukrainian Sporting Sich Association in the Dmitrius Elshishin funds at the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center, or Seredok, in Winnipeg. The syndicate to which the Calgary Herald was referring was undoubtedly the Soviet state-run hard currency store known as the Toksin, which we heard about yesterday in several of the presentations. It comes from the Russian Torgovlya z inostrancyami, which means trade with foreigners. Individuals in the Soviet Union could receive aid from abroad through the Toksin system. In Canada, funds were collected and sent to committees such as the Committee to Aid Victims of the Famine in Ukraine, headed by Elizabeth Skoropadsky in Berlin. Among other things, that committee sent postcards with a famine-related image to Canada for sale in order to raise money for assistance to families or individuals in Ukraine via the Toksin method. A copy of that postcard can be found in the Demetrius Elshishin Fonds in Osererok. Besides the Demetrius Elshishin Fonds at Osererok, I was not able to locate many materials related to the Holodomor in community archival collections elsewhere in Canada. A response to an inquiry made about the holdings of the archives of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada in Winnipeg seemed to indicate that there is no documentation there related to the Holodomor for the years 1932 to 1934. And there is little in the Ukrainian Catholic Archeparchy of Winnipeg archives. There are, though, some valuable items in the Michael Luchkovich papers at the Ukrainian Canadian Archives and Museum of Alberta in Edmonton. These include letters that the Member of Parliament for Vegreville received from Lord Godfrey Walter Phillimore, from Ewald Amende and others in 1934. Of particular interest is the letter that Amende wrote to Luchkovich on the 24th of July 1934, in which he urged the Member of Parliament to insist on Prime Minister Bennett to include him officially in the Canadian delegation to the League of Nations and to, quote, come personally to Geneva in September, unquote. Now, however valuable such archival sources may be, they do not always provide answers to questions. For example, in June 1933, an editorial in the Edmonton Ukrainian language newspaper Ukrainsky Visty expressed dismay at the lack of any treatment of the famine in the parliaments of countries inhabited by Ukrainians, namely Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Canada. And this actually relates a little bit to the discussion we had at the end of the sessions yesterday. Then in November 1933, an editorial in the same newspaper, that's Ukrainsky Visty, again conveyed frustration, though this time it was at the passivity towards the matter by Canadian elected representatives of Ukrainian descent specifically. In 1933, 5 individuals of Ukrainian descent held political office in Canada. 1 in the federal parliament, 2 in the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba, and 2 in the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. When the famine was brought up in the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan in March 1933, action was urged. James G. Gardiner, the leader of the Liberal opposition, remarked that there was, quote, no better way for the Anglo-Saxon countries to act than to provide 20 million bushels of wheat, unquote. The federal government seems to have never directly commented on this proposal. But its position may be inferred from its standard responses to resolutions submitted by Ukrainian groups and others. These groups were told that the Canadian government could not organize relief, quote, under the sovereignty of another government in the absence of any indication that such action would be acceptable to that government. And this was a point that Bohdan brought up yesterday. From a letter dated 27th of March 1933, that is among the Premier James Garfield Gardiner papers at the Provincial Archives of Saskatchewan in Regina, it is clear that while Gardiner believed that the federal government should act in some way, he also was aware of the particular circumstances of the Soviet case. He described the Soviet Union as a state that was, quote, so far apart from all the other great nations of the world as to render the bringing of assistance to their people so difficult as it is at present, unquote. Cornelius W. Wiebe, a Mennonite who represented the constituency of Morden and Rhineland as a member of the Liberal Party, spoke about the famine in the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba on the 3rd of May 1933. He proposed no specific action or made no motion in connection with the famine, but did want to draw the legislature's attention to constituents who had learned of the plight of relatives in the USSR. Michael Luchkovich raised the matter of the famine, in a major way, in the Canadian House of Commons, but later, on the 5th of February 1934. The question is, why not earlier? And why did the MLAs, that is the members of the legislative assemblies, of Ukrainian origin not seem to have done so at all? I have not been able to find the answer to this question in any of the archival materials reviewed in Canada. However, I did find what may be a clue in an archival collection outside of Canada. The one in question is the Ukrainian Bureau in London collection in the Polish Institute and Sikorsky Museum in London, about which we will hear more later in the presentation by Roman Wysocki. The Ukrainian Bureau in London operated between 1931 and 1940 and was directed by Vladimir Kisilevsky, who was born in Western Ukraine and emigrated to Canada in 1925. I was aware of the Vladimir Julian K. Kisilevsky funds in Library and Archives Canada and consulted that collection for my book. But I was not aware of the Ukrainian Bureau in London collection until recently, and I have two people to thank here. One is Olga Andriewsky and Miroslav Shkandry. That collection in London includes correspondence between Kisilevsky and Luchkovich. In a letter to Luchkovich, dated the 30th of May 1932, Kisilevsky drew attention to the Imperial Economic Conference that would convene in Ottawa in July, and suggested that a deputation of Ukrainian representatives be assembled that could put the case of Ukrainians in Europe before the British delegation. In a second letter, dated the 31st of May 1932, Kisilevsky enclosed copies of letters he had sent to Canadian MLAs of Ukrainian descent. He noted that the British press was becoming more interested in Soviet Ukraine, where the population was experiencing hunger, while the Soviet regime prepared to continue its practice of dumping grain in the world market. He thought that Canada likewise would become more interested in Ukraine. In his reply to Kisilevsky, Luchkovich intimated that he had spoken to Albertan MLAs, Isidor Goretsky and Peter Mitskev, and both were of the opinion, which he seemed to share, that since it was an economic conference and not a political one, and centered only on matters of trade, would it not in fact do the Ukrainian cause harm rather than good by raising it in the wrong moment and place? Perhaps the reticence of the MP and MLAs during 1933 could be explained to some degree by the cautious attitude expressed in Luchkovich's reply. I don't know, In any event, Kisilevsky did not accept the view that the Ukrainian question would be out of place in the conference in Ottawa. In a subsequent letter to Luchkovich, he clarified that it was Soviet as well as Polish Ukraine that he had in mind. He argued that Soviet Ukraine was relevant to the conference because Soviet wheat was being dumped in Europe in competition with Canadian grain. And this was only possible because, quote, Ukrainian peasants have had their own supplies taken from them and are in a terrible starving condition, unquote. There were journalists from Canada in the Soviet Union during the time of the famine, and some materials pertaining to two of them, Carlton J. Ketchum and Pierre Van Passen, have been kept in Library and Archives Canada. I will just say some words about Van Passen. Beginning in 1932, Van Passen spent 3 years in the Soviet Union as a correspondent for the Toronto Star. In August 1933, he was assigned to investigate reports of the famine, specifically in Ukraine. Apart from the Star, the Toronto Star, his reports were also published in other Canadian newspapers. An unfinished biography of Van Passen forms part of the Hugh Whitney Morrison Funds at the Library and Archives Canada. In that unpublished biography, Morrison, who worked as a reporter for the Toronto Star, wrote that Van Passen had, quoted, reported in generally favorable terms on the energy and spirit of the Russian people, unquote. But that, quote, his observations on the famine in the Ukraine got him in temporary trouble, unquote. The famine had apparently, quote, disturbed him, but did not wholly dissuade him of the laudable aims of the Bolshevik Revolution, unquote. Van Passen acknowledged the famine's existence, but had been able to see, quote, a quite different face of communist behavior, unquote. While reports by Van Passen generated interest, not all readers considered them convincing. In a 1936 letter published in the Winnipeg Tribune, reference was made to what the letter writer described as, quote, Van Passen's misrepresentations of facts, unquote, which, quote, caused most self-respecting newspapers to close their pages to his misinformations, unquote. And in a book about Ukraine and its diaspora, but during 1932-1933, Mikhailo Marunchak wrote that the Western correspondents who helped the cause of Soviet propaganda, wrote about Western correspondents who helped the cause of Soviet propaganda through their writings about the famine. Two names that he mentioned were Walter Duranty of the New York Times and Pierre Van Passen of the Toronto Star. In a letter found not in an archive in Canada, but again in the Ukrainian Bureau in the London collection, Van Passen wrote about his reporting on the famine. And this is quite, well, for me personally, it was quite the find. Louise Gibson of the Bureau had written to him to an address in Paris on the 2nd of November 1933 and asked that he let them know when he would visit England. The Bureau, she said, would welcome the opportunity to discuss the situation in the Soviet Union with him. In his reply, Van Passen claimed that he wanted to launch a, quote, a sort of pro-Ukrainian campaign, unquote, in the newspapers he served in Canada and in the United States. But he could not do anything if his hands were, quote, not upheld. He described the Toronto Star as an influential newspaper that was, quote, out and out pro-Soviet, unquote. Yet even so, he continued, it published a series of 10 articles on the situation in Ukraine by him. Van Passen then went on to say that, quote, without beating the bush, unquote, he reported that the, quote, situation was gruesome, unquote. If Van Passen had in mind his article, Ukraine practically won over to the Soviet farm plan, datelined Krumenchuk, that's how he referred to the place, Ukraine, which was published on the 13th of September 1933. Then in that piece, he wrote, how much time do I have, Frank? 2 minutes. Okay, I'll zip through this as quickly as I can, because it is interesting. You'll see the contrast. Summarize? Okay. Okay, so I'll just summarize. And very quickly then, in his pieces, he seemed to downplay the famine. In fact, he never really emphasized the gruesome aspects of the famine. But in this letter, I'll just quote you very quickly what he did say. That in one village, Krumenchuk, nearly all the inhabitants, this is what he was sharing to Louise Gibson in his letter, nearly all the inhabitants had died last winter and this spring from hunger, and that I personally saw no less than 6 corpses, in the company of a man named Gregory Larzerson, my guide, a member of the party, but one whose enthusiasm of the years before had dwindled to nothing, and which had even changed into blind rage against the Stalinist regime. And anyway, so nothing like that appeared in his reports. But the point of sharing this piece, this particular letter with you, is just to demonstrate what one can find in little-known archives. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Bohdan Figol from the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center. He will speak on nascent Canadian Holodomor research in Canada.
Thank you for the invitation. A pleasure to be here in Edmonton. Before I talk about the actual archival material, I guess I should explain a little about the start of what we now know as the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center. Professor Yuri Dorevich, one of the founders and longtime presidents of UCRDC, in a speech to the Shevchenko Society December the 1st, 2018, talked about his upbringing in Winnipeg, and he talked about the fact that within the community, we kind of knew about the Great Famine. There was books, Dolet's book, Black Deeds of the Kremlin, but outside of the community, for some reason, not only wasn't widely known, and the people that they talked to pushed back on it. So with the coming of the 50th anniversary of the famine in 1983, a number of his friends, academics, plus Ukrainians in the business community, came together to see how they could somehow affect the situation. So they said, well, you know, they brainstormed, they said, well, what do we do? Finally, they came up with, well, we're going to make a documentary, because there hadn't been one. So, well, we're going to make a documentary. Well, we need materials. We better start research. So archival material, eyewitness reports would be good. So they started in 1982 to begin to try to find eyewitnesses. Please remember, we're talking 1981, 1982. There was a great reluctance on a lot of people to talk about the Holodomor, what we now know as the Holodomor. People were saying, you know, I still have family in Ukraine. They could be hurt. You know, it was hard to get some of this material. But, okay, they did decide to go ahead with it. In preparation for this, I actually found the original materials, and the original budget for this research and the movie was $186,000. So, being the generation that I am, I went to the economic section of Google and found out what that would be in 2019, in today's dollars. That, folks, is $494,000, almost $500,000. They did go over budget, like everybody does. They went up to about $221,000. That's about $588,000, over $500,000 for this movie that they made. Anyways, so they went ahead, they started interviewing, gathering materials, and in 1984, the premiere, okay, of the film, okay, Harvest of Despair, premiered in Toronto. It went on to win a number of awards, as well as be even nominated in the documentary area for an Academy Award. Never won, but still had a number of interesting places that the movies actually shared. Anyways, the research that went into the movie still forms the initial and the largest section of our collection. We have currently 197 interviews of Holodomor participants, okay? We have all of the information that deals with the making of the movie, all of the research, okay? Just as an aside, okay, we have 211 16-millimeter reels, 101 U-matic videos. We digitized all this information, by the way. It takes over 2 terabytes of information in case someone would want to take a look at this. There are some really compelling interviews in here. If you want to, we kept all the documentation on the making of the movie as well, the documentary. If you want to understand just some of the stuff that they had to go through to make this thing happen. anyways, part of the, I'm not going to go through all of the interviews, but some of the ones that I would like to highlight, okay, are the ones coming up. Right now, this is fairly standard, but these were interviews that were done in 82, 83, so we go back a way. First one is Campbell, okay. These were a Scottish wife and husband, really true socialists, I guess what Eric Hoffer would call true believers. They went to Ukraine and they came back and they described gangs roaming, orphan children. They became former communists, okay, and they did interview with us. Then there's the Henke interviews. This is the son and wife of the German consul in Kyiv, and they described the starvation scenes in Kyiv at this time. Von Herwath, who was the attaché for the German embassy, he talks how the Soviets stage-managed Harriet's trip in Ukraine, in Kyiv at that time. Grigorenko, General Grigorenko describes his experience with the uprisings in Ukraine and Kazakhstan and his role in that area. Lev Kopelev, okay, who was a party activist in the early 30s, later became a dissident, an idealist, another true believer. He describes the conditions in Ukraine at that time. Obviously, James Mace, okay, prominent, talks about his work with the Senate hearings, as well as the Western cover-up of the journalists at that time. And of course, Malcolm Muggeridge, okay, from the Manchester Guardian, one of the first reporters to report on the famine. These are detailed interviews that we have in our collection. The next large collection that we have is the James Mace collection. James Mace, okay, asked UCRDC to assist by gathering Canadian interviews of famine survivors, okay. This was done by the volunteers and the people that were working in UCRDC, and what Mace then did was he reciprocated by allowing UCRDC to copy the originals of his interviews and be made available for research in Canada. So we currently have 207 interviews from James Mace. This is about 201 hours. We have both the original audio tapes, okay, which were acquired by our by our head archivist, Irina Venichka, and these are now currently been digitized, are also available to you in a digital form. The next collection, which is quite interesting, some people call the Manyak collection, but I'm calling the Manyak-Kovalenko collection. The reason for that is, I believe, Manyak's wife, Kovalenko, okay, contributed as much, if not more, to this collection. It should actually be called the Manyak-Kovalenko collection. This was a project that was initiated in Ukraine in 1988. Famine survivors were asked to write about testimonials about the famine, about the Holodomor. This was not a structured study. They were asked to write in their own words what they remembered, what they could remember. There were no hard questions, okay? The Manyaks, okay, were able to gather, okay, by early 1990s, over 6,000 interviews. Again, our head archivist, Irina Venichka, somehow traveled to Ukraine in 1990 and was able to get in contact with Manyak, who would show up with a suitcase, he and his wife. He would never let that suitcase out of his hands, okay? Somehow they found a photocopier in Kyiv in early 1990. Now, it wasn't as bad as before. It wasn't like the photocopiers were being controlled, but it wasn't like there was a business depot in Kinko on every corner. So them trying to find a photocopier and photocopy the materials was not an easy task. We have 136 of these letters in our collection right now, and the materials made it into a book on the famine genocide in Ukraine 1932-33, a publication of UCRDC in 2013. What we did this summer is we have scanned in all of these letters as well as the envelopes they arrived in. And these letters have been transcribed, and we are beginning to translate them into English for for easier use of researchers if they would like to take a look at this material. A collection going back to the early days, which was gathered by Professor Roman Serbin for UCRDC, was the International Red Cross. He traveled to Geneva, where the headquarters of the International Red Cross is, and he was able to collect 117 individual documents, which are in our archives. Some of the ones, that I think are interesting is a letter from the German Council, 1933, from Kiev, where he states that already 1.5 million people have died. In another one, there's a declaration from Archbishop Initzer, where he's telling the Red Cross, asking them that they need to awaken the conscience of the world to what's going on in Ukraine at this time. There's also a letter from 1934 that talks about the worsening conditions, including cannibalism in Ukraine. In a Canadian connection, there's a couple of letters from the Canadian Red Cross where both Ukrainians and Russians were writing to the Canadian Red Cross and saying, we are getting letters from our relatives, our family in Ukraine, that there's a famine going on, and we are prepared to give up our reserve stocks. These are the grain that they put aside for next year's seeding, and they didn't have the money, to get it over to Europe, but they were prepared to give up their reserves grain stocks to the Red Cross if they could get it to Ukraine and to save the people there. I was never able to follow the line whether the International Red Cross ever responded to the Canadian Red Cross, so this may be something that could be interesting perhaps to Professor Cipko there. On a local bent, we were able to acquire the materials for the Holodomor famine project here in Edmonton. These were materials that were gathered by Bohdan Shulakevich. These are documents that they put together justifying the Holodomor monument here, plus the actual presentations to the City Council, which finally did install the world's first Holodomor monument in 1983. So we have the proposal, the backup documents, also a series of letters from the Soviet embassy protesting, the actions of the City Council here, and a series of the letters going back and forth, plus a number of designs by Lyudmila Temerdy on the actual Holodomor monument that's here in Edmonton. We are trying to move ahead also. We initiated a project back in 2015, which we're calling the Children of Holodomor Survivors Collection. We have interviewed 21 children of Holodomor survivors. We're trying to understand the impact of living with at least one, if not two, Holodomor parents, what that meant in terms of education, socialization, cultural tendencies and things like that. We have our first initial report ready. The project is led again by Ira Yudavenichka. Sofia Isayu is the lead interviewer researcher on it, and both of them would be happy to talk to you about their research results if you're interested in that. We also have a series of funds, which we're calling the Unpublished Holodomor Memoirs. This is a diverse collection, mostly personal collections. They've been donated either by the actual survivors or by their children. We have 13 of these archival donations. They're originals, handwritten, sometimes typed. They're anywhere from 3-page handwritten to 75-page typed memoirs. And if you'd like to come down and take a look at this material, they're available for research. Finally, while not strictly archival, we do have a Holodomor Monuments in Ukraine project. This was created by UCRDC on the basis of information that was collected by Vitaly Ohnienko, who's a senior scholar at the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory. The site has visual aspects of Holodomor monuments, the geographical breakdown of monument locations, plus links to other Holodomor sites. Anyways, we continue to try to gather more Holodomor materials. This is still active, and thank you for letting me share this information with you today.
Thank you for the information and your conciseness. Our next speaker is Olga Andriewsky from Trent University. She will be speaking on eyewitness and survivor collections of the early Cold War period, 1945 to 1955. Professor Andriewsky.
Yes, I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers and especially Oksana Vinnik for doing such a terrific job. Thank you very much. The decade I study is 1945 to 1955. That is from the end of the war to the early years of the Cold War. And it's actually turned out to be one of the most interesting and important areas for research on the Holodomor in recent years. Several historians have been working in this period, Bohdan, Oksana, myself. What makes this decade so remarkable is the convergence of two factors. First, the very large number of refugees from the Soviet Union who were witnesses and or survivors of not just the Holodomor, but decolonization, collectivization, and the terror, both Ukrainian and non-Ukrainian. And secondly, and no less importantly, the existence of peoples and organizations and institutions in the West who were interested in these refugees or soon became interested in these refugees for their own purposes. These people, these organizations, these institutions helped collect and preserve and or publicize the personal accounts and testimonies of these refugees. So the result is a substantial body of firsthand accounts of the Holodomor produced in this period in a variety of different settings. Many of these accounts were in fact published. Some were translated into, actually many of them were translated into English and published, and surprisingly are accessible to researchers in digitized forms today. The irony is that none of these collections, not one of the collections, started out as a Holodomor project. And what is crucial was really the creation of a space in which Holodomor stories could be told. And what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is sketch out three of these spaces that opened up between 45 and 1955. And specifically, I'm going to focus on four archival collections of eyewitness accounts and testimonies that were created in these spaces, and I'm going to talk about how these spaces came into existence. So the first archival collection I want to discuss was the first to be amassed, the last to be discovered, and is by far the most unusual. It's the so-called Oseradok collection. The story of the Oseradok collection may be familiar to some of you, but for those of you who don't know the story, Oseradok is the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center in Winnipeg. It was founded in 1944 by the Ukrainian National Federation of Canada as a museum and a library, and it still exists today. Well, in early 1947, on the initiative of Dmytro Doroshenko, Oseredok announced a memoir writing competition. Now, Dmytro Doroshenko should be a name that's familiar to many of you. He was, of course, himself a historian. He'd just been elected in 1945 as the first president of the Ukrainian Free Academy of Sciences. He had spent the interwar period in Czechoslovakia and Poland. And in 1947, he had just arrived a year earlier in Winnipeg from a displaced persons camp in Germany. And in 1947, he was himself in the midst of writing the second volume of his own memoirs. And he was also completing a chapter on the Second World War for a new edition of Ivan Krypiekevich's Velika Istoria Ukrainy, which is published in Winnipeg in 1948. So he was interested in memoir writing. He was interested in the topic of the Second World War. And the memoir writing competition was initially conceived as a project to encourage people to write about their war experiences. It was aimed quite directly at Ukrainians in the displaced persons camps in Europe. The ads were placed in Ukrainian language newspapers in 1947 and 1948. And the committee cast its net very widely. That is, it encouraged workers and farmers and teachers and professors and political leaders and artists and people from all walks of life to write their memoirs and enter this competition. And the ad assured people, don't worry if it's difficult for you to write whatever you can. This will be immensely important to future historians. Well, I want to pause at this moment and just to emphasize how unusual this idea was, how remarkable it was for its time. There were exceptions, but for practical purposes, no historians in North America were doing history in this way in 1945 or 47. The very first oral history program was established in 1948 by Alan Nevins, a journalist at Columbia University. But the aim of that program was to interview people who were famous and powerful. It focused on elite subjects. This idea of asking ordinary people about their life experiences was quite remarkable. That turn to social history, the emphasis on life experiences, was still many decades away. It is worth noting that the Jewish community was also involved in gathering eyewitness testimonies and memoirs from about 1944 on. But again, these are not professional historians. These are people largely interested in just amassing this evidence. And it takes a long time for this kind of social history, oral history, to make its way into the historical profession. So Dmytro Doroshenko was doing something quite remarkable. And by the end of the competition date, by March 1948, Oseredok had received 65 entries. The entries, which I had a chance to I looked at the whole collection last May. It's amazingly eclectic. That is, people were asked to write about the war, but very few actually wrote only about the war or strictly about the war. Some of the entries actually focused on the First World War. There are accounts of Sichovi Strelci there, the Sich riflemen. There's one account that goes back to the 1890s. Many people wrote about the 1930s. One author wrote an entire large manuscript about Plast and Peremyshel in the interwar period. Some authors submitted novels, others short stories. One submission was poetry. They wrote largely in Ukrainian, but also in Russian, and a couple of entries were in Polish. And in fact, as the first submissions began to arrive, the committee sort of quietly revised the terms of the competition. They loosened the criteria to allow all memoirs, that is, not strictly focusing on the war. What is of interest to us, of course, are the accounts of the Great Famine. Ludmila Hranevich and her team have identified approximately 15 manuscripts out of 65 that related in some way to the Holodomor. And in fact, the person who won the competition, Fedor Pihido, who wrote under the pseudonym of Pravoberezhny, he had submitted 2 entries. One was an account of the war from 41 to 45. It actually includes some of the earliest observations of the Holocaust in Ukraine. He was in Kiev at the time of Babyn Yar. It was published as a book in the 50s. It's been republished in Ukraine, and I'm hoping that someday we actually get an English language translation as well. The other submission he made, and so he won for his 2 submissions, was a long account of 1933 in Ukraine. Pihido himself had worked for a construction trust, and so had traveled widely. He kind of had a privileged perspective to observe the Holodomor in Ukraine. An annotated edition of these 15 manuscripts is currently being prepared for publication by HREC. Most of these accounts were written in the DP camps. They were written at a time when the refugees, the Soviet refugees in particular, were waiting for a decision about their fate. And if you were to read these accounts, there's a kind of sense of urgency to tell the world the true story of the Soviet Union, Soviet system. Well, the second collection that I'd like to discuss is the Harvard Project on the Soviet Social System, also known as the Refugee Interview Project. The Harvard Project was by far the largest and the most successful of a number of early Cold War efforts to exploit the Soviet refugees for research purposes. The project was launched in 1949 by a group of social scientists at Harvard University, almost none of whom actually knew anything about the Soviet Union. They were superstars in the field of social sciences, but this was kind of an introduction to the Soviet Union. There's a whole generation of graduate students who then went on to establish the field of Soviet studies that worked on this project. The project was a large project. It had funding from the United States Air Force. Between 1950 and 1953, the Harvard team interviewed a couple thousand Soviet refugees living in Germany and Austria, and then they actually interviewed some people when they had already arrived in the United States. They administered 2,000 questionnaires and conducted 700 in-depth interviews. The interviews have been digitized. They're available online. There's a wonderful search function. And there are generations of scholars in the period who have worked with these archives, even before they became digitized. The aim of the project, however, was to study how the Soviet Union worked. That is, to study the structures, the institutions, the functions in the Soviet system. So, for example, they were interested in how collective farms worked, how they were administered, how they were managed. They weren't interested in the life stories of the people that they were interviewing. But what they very quickly discovered was that the refugees had their own stories to tell, and they were determined to tell them. Merle Feinsod, who's a political scientist at Harvard, went in 1949 to do a preliminary sort of study to kind of begin to set up this larger project. And this is an excerpt from his field notes. And you can really see the kind of condescending attitude of the Harvard researchers towards their subjects. Whenever I have spoken to simple people, the first thing that they all want to talk about is just this, how Stalin purposely created a famine. This idea has become so deeply embedded in the minds of the peasants in particular that I feel safe in saying that it has become part of the folk saga of the Ukraine. with more legendary importance than any of the positive achievements of the communist regime in that region. It is a large and radical part of the historical thinking of the peasants. The point is that the blame is squarely heaped on Stalin and the communists with complete justification. When it came to the formal interviews, however, the refugees were never asked about the famine. And much to the consternation of the interviewers, the people they were interviewing insisted on talking about the famine nonetheless. And not just the famine, they talked about collectivization, decolonization. These were clearly defining moments in their lives, and they wanted to tell the interviewers so they would understand what they had lived through. For the interviewers, they had long lists of questions that they had to get through, and this was considered off-topic, a digression, not really relevant to the goals of the refugee interview project. Interviewers were constantly trying to steer their respondents back to the prepared list of questions, and there's a kind of tension, a battle over meaning that runs the whole course of the interviews. Well, the flaws of the Harvard study notwithstanding, it did create a second space, however circumscribed, for refugees to talk about the Holodomor. The great value of this Harvard project is the scale and also the scope of the project, how many people were interviewed. The project designers went out of their way to recruit various subgroups of the population by class, by nationality, by gender, by age. Ukrainians comprised about 24% of the interview group. So they were aiming to get a cross-section as much as possible of the Soviet population. One of the individuals they interviewed, for example, was an 82-year-old illiterate Ukrainian peasant woman who recounted the destruction of her family during collectivization and the famine. The second thing that's unique about the Harvard project are the comments by the non-Ukrainians. And by non-Ukrainians, I mean self-identified non-Ukrainians, about the famine of 32-33. Virtually every refugee, whether they were Ukrainian, self-identified or not, who had lived in the Ukrainian Republic, mentioned the famine in the course of the interview. And again, they were never asked about this, but they talked about it. They insisted on talking about this. One of the refugees interviewed was, in fact, an Odessa lawyer, a Russian, who in 1933 had defended women against the charge of cannibalism. Perhaps most significantly, the Harvard interviews show that in the 1930s, rumors about famine in Ukraine, as opposed to or as distinct from famine in the countryside, reached well beyond the borders of the Ukrainian Republic. In some cases, this information was carried by individuals who had been sent to Ukraine in 32-33 in some official capacity. In other cases, they were Ukrainians that had managed to flee to the Russian Republic who helped spread the word. And here's an excerpt from one of these accounts of someone who was in Moscow who was hearing at the time in 33 about famine in Ukraine. And what this, I think, suggests is that famine in the minds of those who had lived through those years, whether they lived in Ukraine or in Leningrad or in Moscow, had a defined location, a distinct geography. That is, they talked about famine in Ukraine or famine in Ukraine and the Kuban and the Don. This is how people thought of those hungry years of 32-33. And I think it's this population of non-Ukrainians that really makes the Harvard study so exceptional for Holodomor studies. Now, the famine of 32-33, I hasten to add, never really figured in many of the works that came out of the Harvard project of the 1950s and 1960s. They wrote about collectivization, they wrote about terror, but in all of the books that, this kind of founding literature of Soviet studies, there was really almost no attention paid to the famine itself. But as good scholars, they preserved the records of the study. They're available at Harvard, and as I've said, they've been available to scholars for many, many years. Well, the third and final space that I'd like to talk about is Cold War Washington, D.C. The onset of the Cold War provided Ukrainian refugees with the opportunity to give public testimony, to serve as witnesses, as American political leaders themselves debated how to deal with the Kremlin. This was the great debate about whether they should pursue a policy of containment or military rollback. This opportunity absolutely galvanized East European communities, and especially Ukrainians in the United States and Canada, not just Holodomor survivors. The Holodomor survivors were just beginning to arrive in North America from the displaced persons camps in Germany. Sort of the first people arrived in 1949, and many more came in 51 and 52. But it also galvanized Ukrainians in the diaspora, many of whom had been active in the international campaign in 1933, the campaign, that great campaign to bring the terror famine to the attention of American, Canadian, British, and European political leaders. So it was the diaspora organizations who helped the Ukrainian refugees just as they were arriving to navigate the corridors of power in Washington. It was the diaspora organizations that helped organize the testimonies, that worked on English translations, who provided interpreters, who identified sympathetic senators and congressmen, and who ultimately helped kind of lead the argument, argue the Ukrainian case. And in many ways, I regard this as a kind of renewal of the great public campaign of 1933 in a much, much more receptive setting. The geopolitical situation had obviously changed. The first opportunity were the Genocide Convention hearings in January 1950. Now, the Genocide Convention had been approved by the UN in 1948. President Truman had submitted the convention to the US Senate in 1949, and in January 1950, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held its first hearings. The campaign to ratify the convention was led, of course, by Raphael Lemkin, the author of the Genocide Convention, who helped mobilize Jewish and other East European groups to help push for ratification. During the hearings, two representatives from the Ukrainian American community testified. The first was Lev Dobryansky, the newly elected head of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, but also, crucially, professor of economics. He had just been hired as a faculty member at Georgetown University. He spoke in his capacity as kind of a Soviet expert, providing an overview and a general catalog of Soviet exterminations, not just Ukrainian, but dating back to 1920. The second representative, however, was Antony Batyuk, the president of the Ukrainian Workingmen's Association, who, as part of his testimony, submitted 15 witness statements about the Holodomor. Witness statements from newly arrived Soviet Ukrainian immigrants. I mean, this is January 1950. And as I look at the name, it's quite clear that he had tapped into the network of the Bandura chorus, choir. So Hryhorij Kitasty and Mishchenko Panasenko, who I guess had arrived in Detroit by that time, wrote statements. They themselves did not appear at the committee. In front of the committee. Their statements were translated into English, read into the hearings, and published as part of the records. Interestingly, both Dobryansky and Batyuk also submitted a whole sort of file of materials, starting with Dr. Amende's report and the appeal of the Ukrainian Catholic bishops. All those documents that had been used in 1933 sort of were resubmitted. The Fish Resolution, American Resolution in 1934. The witness statements, as I've said, were very brief, just a couple of paragraphs each, but their very purpose was to establish that a famine had taken place, and these were eyewitnesses to this event. Well, if you know the history of the Genocide Convention in the United States, you know that it wasn't ratified until 1988. But in Svoboda, there's a very interesting letter published by Lemkin in 1952, thanking both the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America and the Canadian Ukrainian Congress for helping ratify the convention in Canada. And that's something that's really interesting to sort of follow up, I think, what role Ukrainians played there. Well, the culmination of the campaign, however, were the hearings of the House Select Committee on Communist Aggression in 1954, the so-called Kirsten Committee, named after Charles Kirsten, Republican representative from Wisconsin, who served as the chair and who was a fierce, fierce proponent of military rollback. The purpose of the committee was it started out as an investigation of the Katyn massacre, moved on to the Soviet takeover of the Baltic countries, but then broadened in 1954, was renamed and broadened to investigate the subversion and destruction of free institutions and human liberties by world communism. The committee focused almost exclusively on Eastern Europe. There was a subcommittee that was formed to look at Latin America, but the work of the Kirsten Committee itself focused on Eastern Europe. In the summer and fall of, oops, that's not a picture. In the summer and fall of 1954, the committee held public hearings in Munich. They traveled to Munich to interview people. In New York and in Chicago, they heard testimony from over 300 witnesses, many of whom spoke anonymously for fear of reprisal. Others submitted written statements to the committee. The committee produced something like 27 different reports, and including a whole separate report on Ukraine. In the course of the hearings, something like almost 40 individuals provided testimony about Ukraine. Many appeared in person or spoke with a translator on topics ranging from the Bolshevik takeover in 1919 all the way to the annexation of Western Ukraine, the destruction of the Ukrainian churches, including the Ukrainian Catholic Church after the war. In the testimonies, of course, collectivization and the famine figured very prominently. The first volume of the Black Deeds of the Kremlin was, in fact, one of the formal submissions to the Kirsten Committee. I mean, one of the amazing things is how much work was translated immediately into English. By people, translated by people who knew English, but the testimonies, of course, were given by people who, in most cases, hadn't actually learned the language. So the speed with which they were translating things into English is quite remarkable. The second volume of Black Deeds of the Kremlin, published in Detroit in 1955, was devoted exclusively to collectivization and the famine, and includes a foreword by Charles Kirsten himself. Oksana Vinnik and Bohdan Klid have been working with the unpublished materials of the Kirsten Committee, some 47 submissions from the National Archives in Washington, and then their wonderful discovery of 22 additional depositions in the papers of Charles Kirsten, which are housed at Marquette University in Milwaukee. So, to sum up, these accounts simply wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the commitment and the determination of the victims and the survivors to be heard. They had started talking about the famine in the DP camps already. Before even Doroshenko, and Doroshenko probably knew this in 1947 when they announced the memoir competition. There's a tendency to lump all of the victims and survivors as Ukrainian nationalists. But in fact, if one takes a much closer look, most of the survivors, the kind of major figures in collecting and encouraging people to give testimonies were people like Fedor Pehido and Dmitro Solovey, who weren't strictly speaking Ukrainian nationalists. They tended to gravitate around Ivan Baghryany and the Ukrainian Revolutionary Democratic Party. And Pehido and Dmitro Solovey in particular, not only did they write and give testimony, they entered the Oseradik competition, they testified in front of the Kirsten Committee, and very likely also were participated in the Harvard Project, although all of those interviews are actually anonymous. But they also served as kind of influencers to encourage other people to speak about the Holodomor, which, as we know from people who go through these kinds of traumas, is very difficult for them. But there was this one moment where speaking out meant trying to achieve some form of justice. I think that the second volume in particular, or let's take both of the volumes of Black Deeds of the Kremlin, are really a kind of reflection of this collective effort of the survivors and eyewitnesses. My second point, my final point, is that for these collections to exist, for these testimonies to be given, there had to be a receptive audience. There has to be the right political context for stories of state violence to be told in public, whether it's the stories of the Holodomor or violence in Northern Ireland or South Africa or elsewhere. So in this respect, the first decade of the Cold War was kind of this unique moment when survivors and eyewitnesses had a chance to speak, when the memories of what had happened were still relatively fresh, and when, unlike in 1933, they found, for a brief moment, people who were interested in what they had to say. And in many ways, I was thinking as I was listening to Olga Andriewsky's talk yesterday that the refugees are kind of the epilogue to this whole story of the inability to resolve in a peaceful fashion, not just the Ukrainian question, but the whole question of minorities in Eastern Europe in the interwar period. Thank you very much.
Our final speaker will be Roman Wysocki from the Maria Curie-Skłodowska University in Lublin. He will be speaking on the Ukrainian Bureau in London and its documents related to the Holodomor.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to participate in this very important conference. My presentation behind me takes 20 minutes, but I have around. My presentation focuses on documents and context of clergy forgotten information and propaganda campaign of the Ukrainian Bureau in London. This institution publicized information about the Great Famine in the Soviet Ukraine, thanks to which many British politicians were convinced of the truthfulness of the information that was being disseminated. It was the Bureau that printed and sent new bulletins about the starvation in Ukraine to the foreign press, delivered them to the top-level British politicians and representatives of the Western governments. Today, it became extremely important to learn how effective the Bureau's information tactics were and what information they possessed. My presentation attempts to demonstrate this on the basis of documents archived in London today. The Ukraine Bureau in London was a project of Jacob McEhin, completely mysterious and unknown person at that time, who not only provided funds for the operation of the London Centre, but also financed a similar institution in Geneva and satellite office for both bureaux in Prague. Although McEhin failed to realize these plans, he also intended to fund independent information centers in Vienna, Harbin, Shanghai, and Tokyo. The immediate beginnings of the Ukrainian Bureau in London was connected with Jacob McEhin's trip to Galicia in the autumn of 1930, which is short after so-called pacification of Eastern Galicia. Impressed by what he eyewitnessed, he decided to set up an information office that would publicize those events in Western circles. The Ukrainian Bureau began to operate from March 1931. Suppressively, quickly, and for many almost unexpectedly, it started demonstrated an extremely active presence. Despite patriotic declaration of the Bureau founder, he was accused of being a secret agent, of working for Soviet, German, British, Italian, Romanian, or American intelligence. At the same time, to his activity, he came to the attention of intelligence services of various countries, for example, Poland, France, the United Kingdom, and Romania, the Soviet Union, who seamlessly tried to learn about his past and contemporary relationships. The headquarters of Ukrainian Bureau, not be confused with Ukrainian Press Bureau operated between the 1990 and 1920 in London, was at Grosvenor Place. In the 1940, the Ukrainian Bureau in London ceased to exist, but its activity was recorded in the preserved documents. Some of them were taken by Vladimir Kyselevsky, the head of the Bureau, and transported to Canada. There is a very strong connection between these documents and Kyselevsky's diary from the time of his stay in London, very important diary. This part of documents of the Ukrainian Bureau is currently kept in Ottawa, but the largest part of the archived documents of the Ukrainian Bureau is currently displayed in the Polish Institute and Sikorski Museum in London. How the Institute came into possession of the Ukrainian documents is shrouded in secrecy. One version says that the former head of the Ukrainian Bureau, Vladimir Kyselevsky, submitted them voluntarily to the Polish authorities. The material stored at the Polish Institute and Sikorski Museum in London were separated in the collection of the Ukrainian Bureau in London, totaling 4,055 items and comprises several meters of current files. The documents were sent out in a chronicle order, although the order system of files were retained in the case of correspondence between the Bureau and the structures subordinated to it. Most of the documents are in Ukrainian, some of them in English, and less in German, French, and some thousand in Polish and Russian. When starting study of the London collection, we discover that among all identified items, only one item, number 199, was devoted directly to the famine in the Soviet Ukraine. But, indeed, the actual corpus of sources documented in Holodomor, in the London collection, is much more larger. There are no records revealing new facts about the operation of the Soviet authorities and the exact causes of events. Instead, they contain news about the information and propaganda campaign that made it possible to publicize these events in the West. Among these materials, we find, for example, the previously unknown typescript of the Olga Andriewsky work on the starvation in Ukraine, which the author prepared on the request of the Ukrainian Bureau and which was intended to be published in English. An analysis of documents of Bureau brings us closer to learning about Ukrainian citizenship diplomacy and ways of conducting international propaganda campaign by Ukrainian immigrants. Undoubtedly, the Ukrainian Bureau propaganda campaign in the West was possible thanks to the personal involvement of its manager, Vladimir Kiselevsky. He was an extremely talented person. Without him, Makohin's action wouldn't be never brought such results, and his bureaus wouldn't have played such a major role. Apart from Kiselevsky, the staff of bureau consisted of Jakob Makohin and his wife Sue, and also Cecil John Lestrange Malone and his wife, as well as Louise Gibson, employed as secretary. So only 2 persons with Ukrainian background. In 1920, the very important person of this group is Cecil Malone, who in 1920 became a first representative of communist circles in British Parliament. He later joined the Labour Party, and in 1928 he was elected as a Labour member of Parliament. He was important for Ukrainian Bureau because he had numerous personal contacts with British establishment. Thanks to him, Kiselevsky was able to distribute information to British politicians. It is also worth mentioning Kiselevsky's acquaintance with Professor Robert William Seton Watson, the head of Ukrainian Bureau, wrote a doctorate at London's School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and under the supervision of the outstanding expert of national relations in Eastern Europe. The news about refugees from the Soviet Union arriving in Poland and Romania became an impetus for the Ukrainian Bureau in London to disseminate information about famine in Ukraine. On March 1932, the Ukrainian Relief Committee in Romania submitted a memorandum to the League of Nations in an endeavor to make this information public. A copy of this document was sent to the Ukrainian Bureau and made its employees aware of the scale of the problem. Refugees who managed to escape to Romania, Romanian side of the border, reiterated their testimonies about hunger spreading in Ukraine. Hanat Porachivsky, mentioned yesterday, one of the activists of the group, who was in close contact with the London office, confirmed these accounts in his correspondence with Kiselevsky. All of them, he wrote in one of the precise reports, are of Ukrainian and Romanian nationality. Only 1,000 refugees managed to cross over the Romanian shore, but many did not manage to do so and died from Soviet border troops' bullets, either in the Dniester or in Ukraine. In April 1932, more news began to reach London via Geneva and Prague. It substantiated the arrival of refugees from the territory of the Soviet Union to Romania. All the people responsible for collecting this information for the needs of the London Bureau was its representative in Prague, Dmytro Antonchuk, a former member of Ukrainian military mission in Romania. In June 1922, the Ukrainian Bureau in London reported, the English press in recent weeks wrote a lot about the situation in Ukraine. We provided them useful materials. It did not, of course, have a crucial bearing of the information published in British newspapers, but it could have been of help supplying editors with their materials and notes. By organizing an information and propaganda campaign, the members of the Bureau printed and distributed press reports in Ukrainian, which they sent to 30 recipients. It also published a monthly 5-page bulletin with a circulation of 500 copies, and prepared periodical English language press reports and reviews. It's about 90 copies together. The goal of the Bureau was to provide information primarily to the selected British politicians. It was not until number 1922 that Makarin and Kisielewski entered into talks with British humanitarian and aid communities. In mid-1933, the mobilization of Ukrainian communities, including the London Bureau, began again. The undertaken action resulted in establishing process committee and aid committees. On July 1933, Volodymyr Tsarevich, a politician of the Ukrainian National Democratic Alliance in Galicia, sent a letter to Jacob Makarin, who was then in Geneva. He wrote about the concern of Galicia political and church circles with the situation in Soviet Ukraine, in agreement with the Metropolitan Andriy Sceptycki and other Greek Catholic bishops. Ukrainian parties with Galicia proposed carrying out a protest action. It was believed that a similar action could also take place in Ukrainian immigration cycles. It should be accompanied by setting up local assistance communities. Tsarevich was pursuing Makarin, trying to urge cooperation, and great importance was attached in Lviv to the participating of his press office in Geneva and London. Job Makarin, responding to Tsarevich's suggestion, agreed with the opinion about the need to run an adequate campaign. He also assured him, with conveying his deep conviction about the uniqueness of the institution he financed, and he was ready to support action. On August 1933, the Ukrainian Bureau in London sent a letter to Ukrainian Committee in Lviv, in which it signed on the Declaration of Solidarity in Action initiated in Lviv. It emphasized that the offices financed by Makarin believed that the Ukrainian parliament representation in Poland and central institutions in the Ukrainian lands, which directly and actually represent millions of Ukrainian population, are the only one destined to take over the management of the rescue operation. Kisielewski, acting on behalf of the Bureau, professed his willingness to cooperate closely with the Lviv Committee and pursue the efforts to ensure the international public opinion was aware of the situation in Great Ukraine, where the Soviet Moscow authorities led the nation to death by starvation. He also announced that he would inform the British public about the work of Ukrainian Committee in Lviv. In mid-August 1933, Makarin and the Ukrainian Bureau deemed it indispensable to send help to the starving Ukrainians. On August 1933, Galician politicians who co-founded the committee held a meeting and discovered the involvement of the Ukrainian Bureau in London in the international propaganda campaign. The Ukrainian Bureau accepted this official proposition with satisfaction, despite objection to the way the action was organized. In correspondence with employees of the offices, Makarin wrote, "I will be interested in this matter, this is support for the protest campaign, only when I'm convinced that the action is going to help the hungry and not to raise the prestige of part of country, of the political part, and in the worst case, even of some people." In the meantime, the Ukrainian Bureau established direct contact with Caritas, the Save Children Fund, Federation of Jewish Relief Organizations, and the Society of Friends. The preserved documents show that, as in the case of the International Red Cross, talks with them centered on the sending a representative to Ukraine to visually access the situation. The proposal of the Ukrainian Bureau met with the support of Jewish organizations, which at that time were already sending aid to the Jewish community in Ukraine. It was mainly Cecil Merlon that conducted discussion with this charity organization. The first meeting with their representatives took place on September in his private home. Beside them, Kisielewski, Senator Założecki, and Member of Parliament Serbiuk of Bukovina participated in these talks. The efforts of the Ukrainian Bureau, that the joint but still informal British Aid Committee strove to influence the authorities in London, did not bring result until after several weeks of diplomacy pressure. On October 1933, a delegation composed of Cecil Malone, Ethel Christie, and Alice Naik met with Lawrence Cohen, head of the Northern Department of the Foreign Office. He was asked to support the British authorities in their efforts to send a humanitarian mission to Ukraine. On December 1933, the representatives of the Safe Children Fund and the Federation of Jewish Relief Organizations and the Society of Friends established the Advisory Committee for Relief in the Soviet Union. As announced before, it was agreed that the Ukrainian Bureau wouldn't officially participate in it, but it was settled that Kisielewski would become a member of the committee as a private person. The advisory committee was treated as a temporary structure by its founders. They decided that at the moment the funds start flowing, they would create the right border committee to which well-known figures of the British politician scene will be co-opted. The concept was successfully implemented, and the newly created structure received the name Russia Assistance Fund. Because the Ukrainian Bureau could not officially participate directly in the work of the Russian Assistance Fund, its interests were represented by Colonel Malone. He was elected honorary secretary of the organization. In December 1933, according to the information possessed by Kisielewski, the Russian Assistance Fund was preparing to collect funds. It also began to talks with the officials representing the Soviet Turks, by whom he was assumed that with the deposit of at least £5,000, at 50% discount will be granted to the purchase of food. The fund also had talks with talks with representatives of Soviet authorities regarding the provision of assistance in the form of grain. However, the first food parcel was not handed over the Ukrainian until the first half of 1934, while the delivery of subsequent parcels were dependent on whether the fund received a knowledge of recipient from addresses. 1 minute more. In the spring of 1934, the involvement of the Ukrainian Bureau in London is promoting information of a family in Ukraine will be weakened. From June 1934, according to McCaughey's assumption, the main effort to coordinate the so-called famine action fell on the shoulders of a satellite office which he financed in Prague. In 1935, the issue of the famine in Ukraine was moved to back burner in London office, and its attention now began to focus on the organization of Anglo-Ukrainian Committee. The preserved documents, only in the collection store in London, show the participation of the Ukrainian Bureau in the information campaign between 1932 and 1934 in propagating awareness about the Holodomor. Regardless of the organizational failures, there is no doubt that having extremely meager of staff and their disposal, but thanks to the engagement of the manager, this institution became one of the few that planned and, at the best of their ability, participated in the campaign to inform West European society about terror and political repression and the catastrophic frame in Ukraine in the 1931. In the last conclusion, the Ukrainian Bureau in London participated exactly in struggle for memory. It was the winner because thanks to this action, we are just here. Thank you very much.
So if yesterday we concentrated frequently on great powers and a world which did not want to know about the Holodomor and of various attempts to get information through or support through, today we've turned to a much more internal Ukrainian community story, a story of memory, and I would argue also a story of formation of a community and a diaspora. Now, I think there are, throughout the papers, there are the basic issues. Why do I tell my story or the story? That is, for the survivors who reached the West, it was their story, so why did they tell it? For the community, it was as collectively assumed as Ukrainians, it was a collective story. Why do we tell the story of the Holodomor, even if not personally affected through family or ties and relatives? The second question is, why did someone record it? Why did someone want to keep this story? And then finally, why and how has it been kept now? And in these discussions, we are dealing largely with how Ukrainian community institutions, or in some cases passed on in one case to a Polish institution, have kept these records and why they have been kept. But maybe let me go back for a second to that first point of the forging of a Ukrainian diaspora and Ukrainian communities. The degree to which the Holodomor as an issue, as defense funds, as help funds, as later organized actions to get out the message to the outer world, has in many ways shaped the Ukrainian diaspora and continues to do it to this day. Although now, after late 1980s and early 90s, in conjunction with Ukraine. Now, when I looked at the papers, I thought we started with Serge Cipko and those 10 million people hanging on to this large part of the North American continent that was Canada, at a point yet when there was no Canadian citizenship. They were British subjects very largely. And Ukrainians had largely found themselves even on the periphery of the major centers of that Canada that existed at that time. And those of you who know Serge's book, and I much recommend it, it's a fascinating story of which he's given us part of today. But it tells us in many ways as much about what Canada was like in the 1930s and what that community is forming was, as it does on any really effective way to either deliver aid or to get the story out. But then, on the other hand, the last story we heard on the Polish Bureau tells us that immigrant to Canada, Curie-Skłodowska, becomes one of the crucial figures in getting the famine story out. That is, turning to the imperial capital, Canada is still imperial capital, having the linguistic and other abilities to reach to an outer world, when funded and when in the right place, it turned out that the Canadian story is a much more direct story of having played a major role of putting that material out. And I think in that way, quite an interesting way of finishing our discussion. Now, to keep maximum time for our discussion, and we'll have over half an hour for it, I will just mention a few questions or comments to our various presenters. The first, of course, for Serge's story, and I think it came out in it as well, the role to which economics and Bennett's interest in Canada selling wheat or not selling wheat played a role in really shaping big politics in the story. He brings up the letters that come to the Mennonites. I think one interesting collection of letters, which you know about, but I just thought worth mentioning, is that during those very years, Father Majewski in Winnipeg was able to save the life of Metropolitan Lipkiewski by sending aid to him. Quite remarkable in the story in that since Metropolitan Lipkiewski was deposed and he had a lot of religious literature they weren't allowed to hand out in Soviet Ukraine, he managed to send it, and I still don't understand fully how, through the mail to Winnipeg, where it was sold in forming the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada, but certainly showed elements of those contacts. I have one suggestion on why the church archives may seem to be so poor, and that is that the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was, of course, Ioan Theodorovich, who used to spend, quite sensibly, winter in the U.S. and summer in Canada. He used to come up each summer, and his archives have been now refound and are in Bound Brook. I understand 18 large boxes of his archives, but we may have more of a story on the churches and how they affected it if you looked into that material and wondered whether you had looked into it in your evaluation of Canada. Our second story that Bohdan Figol told us how a film created an institute. That is, the desire to use new technology, a new way of getting out, that was obviously not aimed at research initially. Its real aim was to get the story out, as the Ukrainian community of Toronto and those involved decide that they've going to tell their story. And in many ways, it was a collection formed around the needs of the film. The film, as we know, had considerable success. It was considerably controversial, but it really was a breakthrough for getting the story on the Holodomor out. And out of it came the Documentation Center, which is now a community organization. It kept all of its records and kept other records as well, for which we can all be very grateful. It had a purpose of why it had gathered them, but then it knew enough that they had to be. And in many ways, it also shows how the Holodomor as an issue engendered the understanding within the community to collect many other archival materials. That is, it's a much richer archive, and because of it, but it was the Holodomor really that engendered the story, and then it went on to all kinds of World War II and the Divizia and various other records that are now kept. We are all tremendously grateful for their being kept, but I think it brings up one of the issues that I think we are all have to be concerned about as we talk about this. How long are we going to be able to keep them? That is, it is a community organization dependent on volunteers and a generation of donors who largely has passed from the scene who kept this. But it is one of the invaluable collections the community has that now has to face what will the future be of this collection, as well as a number of the other collections that we are discussing, and how that stewardship now, which is so important, can be continued. And wondered if you would mention something on that, of how you see the future of those collections. I think wonderful part of Olga Andriewsky's paper is this issue of timing. Those of us who remember the reaction to Conquest's book remember J. Arch Getty and others who wrote in this field saying that this had been a Cold War sort of introduction by the Ukrainian community of its false story about the famine that had come out of the evils of the Cold War. Cold War was definitely a negative in J. Arch Getty's description. Now, it was also incorrect because he didn't know that in the 1930s the same things were being said by the community. But it does quite clearly show how the good timing of when the community comes with this material. But I think one of the most interesting parts that I find on this is the relative degree of organization that was already prepared, and the bringing back of certain figures many of us remember from many years ago, like Lev Dobransky, whose politics some of us might not agree with, but who turned out to be tremendously important. But one question I have on this is the Doroshenko link. That is, you say that Doroshenko wanted memoirs of the war. Is there any documentation where Doroshenko says why I am doing that? I mean, it must have been the announcement of why we are doing it. But do we know more deeply, what did Doroshenko think he was doing by doing World War II? And why he would not have thought, he meanwhile is writing his own memoirs about World War I and the first Ukrainian state he was involved in. One would have expected that Doroshenko, who now was twice an emigre, he twice had the world collapse and move on, would have seen the importance of doing it. What did he think he was going to do with the war material, and what didn't happen with it? Because something is missing in that story, and we'd appreciate a little more information on that if you would bring it forth. And then on our last paper on the London Bureau, here I can personally say that I actually met Princess Susie. That is Makohon's wife, who lived in Boston later in her life, and who was, I think we can agree, whatever they tried to connect themselves with the Rozumovskys, her princess title was much in question. But she showed up at the initiation of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. That is, the day we moved into the building at Harvard, she appeared there and was a great celebrity for us all at the time. I wish I could say I knew, did anyone try at that point to get any of her material and what happened with her material, if there was anything left of collections. I may doubt that on a way on it. But what I wonder, I still now have found this story, and perhaps in your writings you have gone on, but Makohon still comes out to be such a mysterious figure. I mean, do we have better information now on finances? Do you have anything more exact on, was there any connection with foreign services? Because that would also connect to our story of great powers on it. And then what kind of balancing act were they involved in if pacification had become the major issue which they'd begun, and then the famine occurs? In a way, although we cannot compare the loss of life. That is it 9, the figure we still give of those who were killed in the pacificacja, or some such figure? But this was, of course, the great atrocity to the Ukrainian community of 1930-31. If you look at all of the material put out here in the West, is the Polish pacificacja campaign in Galicia. Then that shifts with the Holodomor story. And how was that balance? Is there any balance in where they're balancing the Western Ukrainian story and the Eastern Ukrainian story? So with that, I opened it up. We have at least 25 minutes. So do you want to quickly answer these, and then we open up for comments and questions?
Okay. Thanks very much for those comments, Frank. I'll just say a couple of things briefly. One, with regards to the Canadian government, and in particular the Prime Minister, about economics. Canada, of course, was in competition with the Soviet Union and other grain-producing countries, and the Bennett government, in particular, reacted against the dumping of Soviet grain cheaply in the world market. What I find that is interesting is the fact that at this particular time he was under pressure, the Conservative government was under pressure to trade more extensively, to lift the embargo with the Soviet Union. And when this proposal was made in the Saskatchewan legislature, on the one hand, during the discussion about the famine, there was a suggestion that the grain could just be given free of charge to the starving people in the Soviet Union. And that was changed in a resolution afterwards, but they spoke about barter. And this word barter came up over and over again in the Canadian press, the mainstream press. As far as Bennett himself was concerned, one particular trait that I've noticed is that he seemed to imply, whenever the matter of dealing with the Soviets was concerned, that if they didn't ask for help, who was he to mobilize that assistance? And there was one telling moment in the speech by Gardner, the Liberal member of the head of the Liberal opposition, where one argument that was made that I found elsewhere in this particular statement, where he said that the world should act to provide 20 million or more bushels of wheat for the starving millions of little children in the Soviet Union. He then went on to say, there are those who would say they will only plant it in the ground and grow more to compete with Canadian wheat. Now, I remember this line in a novel by Gabriel Roy, the French-Canadian writer, who spoke, without giving any dates, of course, about a Volhynian immigrant, an immigrant from Volyn, in northern Alberta, who received correspondence, or was corresponding with his mother, and she was in distress. And she said something to the effect that, well, here we are feeding wheat. Here he was feeding wheat to the pigs, but he couldn't help his mother. So on that point, on the point about southbound Brook, thanks very much for that tip. I am moving towards working on the United States, and it's a response to the famine, focusing largely on the Ukrainian American community. So I will certainly try to see what might be available there, which would also shed light on possibly on the Canadian situation.
Thank you, Professor Sysyn, for your timely questions. This question of how long we're going to keep it going is something that I mean, we deal with it on a daily basis at UCDRC. It's a question of stewardship, and certainly it weighs on my shoulders on a daily basis. How do we keep it going? I think it's something that I think we share with our friends at the Shoah organization. How do we keep this going now that that generation is almost past, okay? How many of those kids are still interested? How do we pass that knowledge on to them, right? And one of the ways we do it is we're always open to hosting school kids, both from daily schools or from the Saturday morning Ukrainian programs. We've done that before. We are connecting with students from Ukraine. We had 2 students from Lviv, from the Ukrainian Canadian, from UQ, from the Catholic University, who worked on 2 theses here just before Christmas in November, December. We hope we attract some more students in both the MA and the PhD programs that would avail themselves of our information. This thing about revitalizing it, our longtime archivist, Yurida Venichka, finally gave up her position, but she's been giving that position up for about 10 years. She wouldn't give it up until she knew, okay, that the people that would take it over are competent and would carry on what she's doing. So she's actually been replaced by a committee of 4, of which I'm one. So I'm a quarter of Yurida, and I'm still struggling with that. But I think our group of 4, okay, has plans to keep it going. So the other thing is just we continue to work with our friends at HREC in terms of passing any information we come across. They work that information. I know some of that information has gone to the Holodomor bus people. So we're trying to keep ties with community organizations to keep ourselves relevant, which then and we also have Valya Coreliu, okay, on our board of directors, who's certainly keeping us on our toes, which comes to our last challenge, which is money. This is always a challenge to any organization. Somehow we're struggling our way through, and we're still, we're looking for sources of funding, whether it's government funding or funding through the community, or even through children of whether it's Holodomor survivors. This is a constant challenge. We're not bad this year. I could give you an update next year. We could be in a better or a worse situation. Thank you.
As to the question of why the competition was originally aimed at memoirs of the war, I can only speculate that I think that Doroshenko and the committee were aware that Soviet authorities kept insisting that these are all Nazi collaborators. And I think, and the fate of the refugees was still hanging in the balance at that moment. And I think the idea was to get people to write, and there are memoirs of people who are Ostarbeiters, to really record their experiences during the war, to demonstrate that they were not Nazi collaborators, and that was part of the idea. And the very fact that Doroshenko chose to write a chapter on the Second World War only a couple of years after it had finished is remarkable. Historians never work that quickly. So I think there was that pressure to show that the Ukrainian experience had been quite complicated during the war.
In short words, the Ukrainian campaign conducted by the Ukrainian Bureau in London on the Holodomor was the second one, the biggest conducted by the Bureau. But of course the biggest was this connected with pacification in Galicia, Eastern Galicia. And exactly after the second campaign, each next war smaller, shorter, and not with this strong like the first and the second. Archives material which is connected to the Holodomor action of the Ukrainian Bureau. It's about a half of all amount documents which are connected with the pacification in Western Galicia. So it's quite a lot of, because all correspondence which is from 1922, 23 and 24 is connected very directly with the problem of Holodomor. It's correspondence between people who work in with the Ukrainian Bureau in Geneva, in Prague, and sometimes in Romania, in Bucharest. When we talk about money, it's the problem, because we don't know the source exactly who gave money for existing the bureau. In many letters, we can find only statement, "I will pay," but exactly who is the founder and where the Jacob McLean Fund any funds for this campaign, we can't find answer in documents in London.
Yeah, I just might add, I mean, it shows you interconnections and conferences. I had never stopped to think before that the Ukrainian community had been prepared for the Holodomor campaign already by the Pacificatia campaign. You know, it just strikes me now that here you had the Western Ukrainians with no context, family with Soviet Ukraine, but they had already been involved in 1930-31 in campaigns all over North America to deal with Polish pacificatia, and in a way that was mobilizing a community. And with that, I open for questions and comments, and we have a microphone here. And please give your name when you ask questions.
I'm interested, this is a question to Roman Wysocki and to Olga Andriewsky. The question I was thinking of when I was listening to your talks was, who owns this story? Because in the 1930s, although the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was involved very heavily with the pacification campaign, they were not involved in the aid to Ukraine during the Holodomor. In fact, they downplayed that significantly. There were a couple of books written, there were some attempts, but that was not their issue. And in fact, if you, from my understanding of the documentation in London, in the Bureau, there was a strong attack by the OUN on that Bureau. They were not friendly at all. And in fact, they saw the Bureau's work on pacification and the Holodomor as competition. Then in the post-war period that Olga in such a talented way put together, similar thing. Eastern Ukrainians were driving the information about the Holodomor. All these people on committees, all these people writing books, all these people doing depositions. This was Eastern Ukraine. Again, they owned it. I think we underestimate that and we don't understand the cleavages within the Ukrainian community unless we bring that forward. And then the story changes a little later, because then OUN, let's call them nationalists, they then begin to embrace this idea. It becomes a mobilizing force, mobilizing issue for them. And now we're living in a period where we don't really make these distinctions. It's part of a defense of Ukraine and Ukrainian history. But I think it's important to state this. It wasn't an education. I disagree a little bit with Frank on this. I don't think the pacification educated the community as a whole. Community gradually, the different sectors of the community gradually came together after the war on this.
What I propose is we will take 3 and then let you answer then. Okay, so 2 and 3 and then a round of answer, and we'll do 2 rounds at least, I think, and carve a little bit from our lunch.
My question has to do, and I believe it's to Olga, has to do with the last image that you showed, the stamp, 6 million and so on, and of course it echoes the other 6 million, yes? And we know that the Holocaust-related 6 million first was spelled out in the fall of 1944 by Ilya Ehrenburg in one of his numerous newspaper articles, and later it was either repeated or independently mentioned in the beginning of 1945 in New York at the conference of the Eva Institute of Jewish Research, and it was published in the New York Times, 6 million, a short note, and it started. And as we know that this estimate, essentially estimate, because the war was going on, turned out to be quite precise, yes, thanks to enormous efforts of 5.9, 5.8. Now, the other 6 million, curiously, also has a Jewish origin. Yeah? It comes from Harry Lank's report, yes, that first appeared in the forwards and later in a revised form in 1935, and I believe was forgotten and came out after the war once again. Yeah? So my question is, what was the destiny of the 6 million? How long it was around, and what did happen later with the 6 million? Yeah, in general.
Thank you. Just brief comments, not questions. May I?
Yes.
First of all, I would like to first comment to address to Serge Cipko. Am I right that am I understood understand properly that you have said that letters were allowed because of collecting money? I think that it is really a very important statement. And I think that we have to check this by consulting the archives, former KGB archives, because there are many collections there which with peristation issues. So letters were under control, and every week, every month, we have reports about these letters. So I think that this statement should be support with such materials from KGB former KGB archives. And speaking about the reasons, it is my question or comment to Olga Andriewsky paper. The reasons of collecting memoirs. I think that it was Ukrainians were pioneers of this collecting memoirs, and the first during the interwar period was Czerwona Kalina action, and then during and it is connected with pacification action about and what Roman Wysocki has said. The second action was during pacification, and Milena Rudnicka did it. So collecting witnesses about pacification made by Milena Rudnicka, and then 10 years later, in September 1941, Milena Rudnicka, except all obstacles, came to Lviv and with support of Ostap Tarnavsky collected memoirs from this Soviet period of occupation of Western Ukraine. So the ground was already ready. And Dmytro Doroshenko, as a historian, was absolutely conscious of what he is doing. And of course, also the after-war period, when a state commission were established in USSR and also in Poland. I'm sure he knew about this. So, for example, Jewish Historian Committee collected memoirs, and it was a great job during the first years of after the war. These collections are of incredible importance. So I think that it is also part of common experience of that time, not only because to provide arguments that we are now Nazi collaborators, but also because it was very common for that time. And just a side comment about collection of Ukrainian Press Bureau and who owns the collection. It was a question of who owns the story, and it is a rephrasing with who owns the collection. It is Polish Institute named by Sikorski, Polish Premier Minister. And I know exactly that Kisielewski didn't offer this collection to Polish authorities. It is obvious from his correspondence after the Second World War, and especially his letters to Susan Makohin. So of course we do not know from about the sources of money, but my guess is that it was U.S. sources. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question and then give a round. Okay, so there are two. Bohdan Klid, Zenon Kohut. Oh, I'm sorry. And then I've got to let them answer on that, and we'll see. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. My
Yeah.
comment is basically triggered by what Miroslav Shkandry said. And the role of the OUN, I think, is not exactly as clear-cut as Miroslav wants to portray it. Mm-hmm. And also of the Banderites or the OUNB after World War II with the Holodomor. One of the first publications on the famine, I think Behido's book was, if not Behido's book, then one of the other, I think the translation of his book into English was financed or published by SUM in Great Britain, which is a Banderite organization. So you have some evidence of support there. The first manifestations in 1948 in the DP camps was an affair that was supported by all of the factions, I think, that were in the DP camps at that time. As far as the 1930s go, Dmytro Andriewsky was an OUN member, and he was head of this committee in Europe that was also preparing information on the Holodomor. So it's a bit, I think, misleading to say that that the OUN was opposed. I mean, there may have been some sort of conflicts, and there may have been different interpretations or different arguments about what to do or when, but I don't think that one can make a statement like that. But what I wanted to originally say is that the Kersten collection in the National Archives and Records Administration not only contains Ukrainian materials, that is, materials from Ukrainians, but Kerstin was collecting materials from all of the peoples who were in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe that were under communist rule. So you can find a lot, the Poles have a lot of materials there, the Baltic peoples have a lot of materials there. I looked through these materials briefly, and there's just quite a lot of interesting and I think valuable material that I don't know if it has ever been looked at by scholars, including the Jewish community, because Kerstin was also collecting material on the persecution of Jews in the Soviet Union. So I did not have time to look through these materials. I just glanced at them, but they're there, and there are lots of boxes.
Okay. So now 1 minute to Zenenkot, 1 minute to Olga Bertelsen, and then answers from them. Okay, sorry, Ihor, but I don't know. Yeah, you will be, no, Zenon, and then you. Okay, good. Yeah, that was the order I saw.
Okay. This is sort of a comment and suggestion. There's great concern now on what will happen to these various collections, which are in various émigré communities and so on. I think that perhaps it's time to move to another level and create some sort of digital Holodomor thing at some institution that will last, and gradually collect from these other institutions these materials. Many of these materials have already been digitized, so it wouldn't be that difficult. Therefore, you would have a center for Holodomor research. Perhaps that's a worthy project to consider for future REC. Thanks.
Thank you for that plug.
Thank you so much. A very brief comment. Perhaps Olga Andriewsky's comment, or actually, you said I am speculating. Your speculation is just right on the mark, because during this particular time, what happened, the Soviet secret police launched an operation, a secret operation called, and I discovered this during the last academic year in the former KGB archives, an operation called Возмездие, retribution. And the task of this operation was to compromise the Ukrainians in the eyes of the Jewish community. And of course, the Ukrainians were identified as Nazi collaborators, all of them. And among them were especially those who previously were part or members of the OUN or UPA. So that's just probably just a very interesting addition to your statement. Thank you.
All right, and now may I ask you to respond?
Me? Okay. Yes. On the matter of the letters, yesterday we heard Miroslav Shkandry make reference to potential for collaboration between the different archival groups. And letters is a project, I think, that would fit very well in any project. If we collected these letters that are available in the Mennonite archives, in other archives, the ones that I refer to in my book, and these are original letters. These are also the letters that were published in the Mennonite press, in the Ukrainian language press, but also in the mainstream press, the ones that were abridged, and in the various newspapers. I think that would be very, very interesting, to collect all these letters and put them in one place, and of course analyze them, and then we have the letters that didn't make it out. the ones that would probably be in the former KGB archives, and I think that would be very interesting as well, because the letters that did go out would be subjected to a very large extent to censorship, and and the pattern that I've seen, at least with these letters, is that the emphasis is on getting help. I don't know if you found the same, Colin, with the ones that you've seen, but that was the emphasis. The other matter that I will bring up here is the number of advertisements for the number of Tocsin-related advertisements in the Ukrainian language press in Canada. Not all the Ukrainian language newspapers carried them, but some of them did. And also in newspapers such as the Toronto Star. I know that there has been a book written on the subject by Elena Wysocki, but I know also that there is some significant research that is continuing on that subject. So thank you for your comments, Olga.
Bohdan, do you have something to add? No? Olga?
Well, there were a couple of issues. I'll start at the end. Regarding the digitization project, one of the things I would love to see digitalized first and foremost is the Oseredo collection, but not just the Holodomor stuff, but to preserve the whole collection, because it really sort of shows subjectivity and meaning and what's important to people as they're writing in 47 and 48, and to kind of go in a predatory way and just pick out the stuff from the Holodomor is useful for Holodomor studies, but it's really worth collecting, preserving the collection in its totality. I'll skip to the 6 million question, because here I can flatter Bohdan, who is a brilliant researcher, and one of the things he discovered was there was a statistician in 1943 in Kharkiv, Sosnovey, it was 43, right, who published an article. He studied on the basis of population losses in Poltava Oblast what population losses must have been throughout the rest of Ukraine, and he was the first to give the 6 million number, and so that's where the origin is for the Holodomor. It wasn't, as sometimes is claimed, that it was an imitation of the Holocaust numbers. It was a number that they came up with during the war, and Sosnovey was active after the war in famine research. Olga's question, absolutely. I mean, there's this great, interwar period. I mean, I live off of the memoirs of the interwar period. What I was trying to do is to show the contrast. Doroshenko's working in a North American context in which North American professional historians do not accept eyewitness accounts from people who are not important. And so, it's part of the story of why this gets lost. I mean, there's the same complaint that a number of scholars have made about Holocaust testimonies, how they're ignored because the focus is on documentary evidence and the final solution. And so the first histories are really Nazi-centric, and in a certain way, that's the problem with the famine, too. The focus is always on Soviet policy rather than the experience of ordinary people. The question of ON is really complicated. Bohdan, showed the way in which kind of ON dips in and dips out of the Holodomor, but it is important to distinguish between ON-BE and ON-M. As well, and their attitudes too. But yes, I mean, that's one of the things. I mean, there's so much tension between Eastern Ukrainians and Western Ukrainians who had never actually been together in the same kind of state or community until after the post-war period. And this is very much the story of Eastern Ukrainians. But it does get adopted amazingly quickly. Already in 1933, I mean, there are, during this campaign in the fall of 1933, there are weddings going on in Pennsylvania where people are collecting, and these are people from Western Ukraine, they're collecting money for relief for the Holodomor. I mean, that's how sort of far it seeped seeped down into the community. It's a really very big, complex, and quite remarkable story of, as Frank started out saying, the forging of a Ukrainian community, diaspora.
I'm not sure you will be able to give correct answer for this question, because when we talk about who is the owner of the Ukrainian Bureau, exactly we should ask two questions: to whom belong in the interwar war, in the interwar period, who was exactly the owner of the bureau at that time. We don't know. Because we don't know who was Makohin. We can research, we can study the problem of structure of the bureau, of campaigns, but we are unable to have crucial information about the most important person, Jacob Makohin. So, it's a mysterious story. Another question is that the Ukrainian Bureau documents, exactly, the Ukrainian Bureau was a private institution. At the beginning of the Second War, the building where the building where the bureau was destroyed during the bombing. So when I was studying the documents, I wanted to find the key in which way these particular documents are just in this institute, in Polish Institute in London. There is no answer for this question. I didn't find answer for this question. However, I have an opportunity to talk a man who said me he had been responsible for this collection when this collection just was transferred to Polish Institute. I can't believe in his story, but because all history of the Polish Institute in London has two faces, exactly. Because a lot of documents of this institute nowadays we can find, for example, in British archives. Why? We don't know how many documents were destroyed exactly by Curie-Skłodowska, for example, and why just this document he took with himself to Canada. So I'm not able to give answer who is the owner of this document, but like a historian, I can say I'm happy that the access to the fund is open.
Okay, and then if I just may, just in answer to Miroslav, I think one issue is what the upper spheres were doing. The other is what those who receive do. So if you were reading Bohdan in the U.S. between 1930 and 1934-5, you would not know that there was a difference of changes or shifts. You were getting material on the Pacyfikacja through 30-31, and then you were getting material on the Holod in 33-34, including the Ukrainian Weekly. The English language newspaper first comes out in 33, and one of its goals are. So one is high politics of these factions fighting. The other is the Ukrainian community in various areas of Pennsylvania and wherever they are, and how they are perceiving it. And I would argue they saw the two movements together. They were overwhelmingly Galician, and we have had Olga Klemenko, who will be speaking in our last session, has done some research on Dnipro, which was the paper of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the U.S., headed by Ioan Teodorovich from eastern Ukraine, in which there are more than 70 articles that are appearing on the famine. And the constituency that gets that paper is I would estimate 90% Galician Western Ukrainian at that point, right? So they're being educated through this into it. So I think we've got to look at really how those groups are formed. As you can see, this was a plug to remind you that we have a final session. We always save the best for last. That is, we are going to reconvene here at 3:15 for a section on research in progress. This is always part of our conferences on the Holodomor. We tend to have last session, sometimes with large numbers of younger scholars whom we invite and bring in. In this case, a fewer number. And the differentiation between younger and older is becoming, I think, more and more irrelevant in their high-quality research. So that we would like to invite you all back for that section, as well as Miroslav Shkendry's sum up of our conference. We are going to take the participants and those from out of town down to see the Holodomor Monument. You're all welcome to join us, and Bohdan has done some research on it. And as you can tell, the Toronto Documentation Center has that whole material. So for those of you who'd like to go down and once again look at that monument, please join us. There is lunch for those who are speakers here outside, and which they will have 50 minutes to both eat their lunch and then go get their coat and join us. It's not as cold as I predicted it would be. We hope those of you who will either find lunch or go with us or join, but come back. And I think you will find it well worth it. And with this, I would like to thank our speakers for their wonderful presentations.